Yo, what's up, my beautiful bitches? It's your boy Nails here, and today I'm going to be talking about the most disturbing horror novel I've ever read at this point in my life, The Long Walk by Richard Bachman, also known as Stephen King, a 1979 one-note horror novel that had my legs aching with extreme pain by the time I finished it, because boy was it a long walk. So, where to begin? There's so much I have to say about such a short story that ironically felt like it took me 10,000 years to read. It was so unpleasant and unenjoyable, which for this type of horror fiction genre horror is the greatest compliment I could give for reason of impact and realism. It was so unenjoyable that it took me over a month to read when I could have read it in a day. Now, the reason why it's so realistic is not because of the plot. The plot is basically far-fetched for reason of being in a future spiritually post-apocalyptic America in which the government has slightly too much control and poverty's out of control. So the powers that be created this sort of economic lottery system to basically, like gladiatorial games, incentivate the masses to purge their inner war to avoid probably some sort of psychologically engineered experiment to get the masses of the idiotic public to avoid any sort of anti-government revolutionary feelings by sort of exploring or expunging their negative energy in the way that like gladiatorial games would. And so that also allows them to fantasize about beating the system by being focused on money, the most dystopian, immoral like concept you can imagine. And we've seen King do this sort of thing in other books before. Not totally believable, but in terms of execution, damn, what can I say? King's a master of immersive, realistic, relatable dialogue, especially of how real actual Americans speak. He understands the vocabulary, the vernacular in a way that's totally immersive. The writing just flows and you're instantly there, and you don't give a shit how implausible or plausible the situation is. If something happens, it happens because it's just really, it lives in the moment, it lives in the present, and it's so damn well written. King has always been a rock star of good writing, and so just if that alone is good enough for me personally give this horror story a 10 out of 10. But beyond that, it's the overall execution of the events that take place on this death march. So, I forgot to explain. Basically, any young man from anywhere can sign up for this lottery death race. There can only be one winner. It's literally a race to the death without too many spoilers. The winner gets supposedly as much money as he will ever need. He can get anything he ever wants for the rest of his life. Okay, so that said, only the most ignorant and naive young men, probably from impoverished backgrounds, would ever agree to such a thing. And they are all sort of more or less dislikable, unlikable. I don't think dislikable is a word. Narcissistic, highly ambitious young men who feel like they have nothing to lose. And so this is, to me, I think qualifies as an example of body horror because, as you can expect, there can only be one winner. How that goes down and how that occurs is horribly shocking and deals with the sort of theme of sort of doom, omnipresent doom and fate, and a realization of the limited capacity of your body against the universe, generally speaking, as these, young men are pushed to their limits and gradually die. And so experiencing that sense of place, getting inside the character's head, it's altogether so well written and so utterly brutal that it is rather draining, and I can actually say it was genuinely scary. I'm going to be honest. Stephen King has been my favorite author since I was about 12 years old. I grew up with him. I never found him genuinely scary, except for a few things about Pet Sematary, but this book, I would say it's genuinely scary, but not in this sort of like jump scare type thing or a sort of existential fear. It's more along the lines of a feeling of deep repressed anger, manifesting in the realization that you've got that immersive quality of feeling like you've signed up for something that you can't actually win or execute, and being at odds with your own limitations, being locked into an unfair world, an unfair system that gets exponentially more unfair as you get to death. With anyone who lives in the blue-collar workaday world or has similar roots, of Not Being Rich will understand what sort of infinitely relatable, body horror type situation this has on you as a sort of soul-sucking, soul-draining experience where depression just mounts and you start to feel like you're a part of the living dead. And as you read this, you're also sort of asking yourself, why? Like, if there is a theme, it's brutality and pain of life. And it's all very much confusing as to why you would ever read such a thing. And I found myself constantly asking myself, wow, this just gets more and more brutal and horrible, and yet I already know how it ends. So it's the knowing of how things are going to end for us that's relatable, and the background theme being death, that makes this a standout horror story of inescapable fate and doom and gloom. So reading this book is also meta, and it was probably intentional and a genius move by the creativity of the author to get us to feel like we're persisting on this seemingly suicidal journey along with the protagonists. And that in and of itself is a very, very disturbing, deeply mentally and emotionally disturbing experience. I've never quite experienced something quite so powerful. Now, this may not be exactly quite as immersive and therefore impactful and interesting to certain people who like horror, who are looking, but I must say, I must be honest here, why I think it had such a big effect on me is because I've signed up for things like this before. It reminded me of signing up for a church service volunteer mission when I was very young for the LDS Church. That would take 2 years of my life, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't really understand the impact of my decision to serve a mission until I was in a foreign country of Brazil. And after realizing I was there and I couldn't get out and having to deal with the reality of the physical exertion and other mental stress and social and emotional stressors and difficulties of the mission, it really does feel like you're pitted at odds with yourself and you have no way out, and you feel like this slow suffocation that is relatable. It's relatable to anyone who's ever signed up for a tough job or the military or anything in which they're very keenly aware of their limitations and their mortality. And it's just a very horrifying experience to realize what your current actual power level is in regards to a heightened level of reality most people choose not to think about. The reality being our mortality, our death, our imminent death, and our limited present power, which is a confrontation to the level of horror that most people would want to look away from. Well, facing that horror and reading this book is definitely a challenging experience. I was definitely challenged by it. Although I didn't enjoy reading it, I have to give this book a 10 out of 10 for in terms of quality, for its overall impact on me. One of the most effective horror stories I've ever read. The most disturbing book I've read at this point overall. So I do highly recommend, if you're already a fan of brutal horror fiction, which has this sort of body horror aspect that really builds rage up inside of you. The Long Walk by Stephen King, you can't do much better, I think. So, yeah, highly recommend. Also, a couple things. I personally have a theory that I know is not very original, but being a super Stephen King nerd and fan, he probably wrote as Richard Bachman to have sort of insurance by going a little bit further in terms of intensity with certain ideas he wanted to write about and explore. And that's my theory. And so there's a sort of safety net writing under a pen name, because I also read Rage, but I have yet to read Roadwork and The Running Man. I'm not sure what other stories were published under this pen name, Richard Bachman. But they do seem so far to me to hit differently and have a sort of level of, like, I'd call it like more one note, like it's like a steady stream of sickening horror that's really more intense and has a sort of violent streak to it that seems different from a lot of the more story-based horror stories that he started, especially in the 70s, like Carrie or The Stand or The Shining or whatever. And these stories do hit differently. They're like, I think they're another level of intensity than a lot of King's other books. I've read about 25 of them in my life, I want to say. So yeah, I will next be reading Roadwork by Stephen King, aka Richard Bachman, aka Stephen King, in order, because I'm currently slowly reading and rereading mostly all of Stephen King's works in the order that they were published, and it's fun for me to nerd out about and view an author's evolution and stuff, and notice things about how they develop writing style techniques and storytelling techniques, and change and grow as an author most of the time. Not always, sometimes they regress and get worse, but most of the time they definitely grow in skill. I think that's definitely the case with someone like Stephen King, who knows how to write and tell an amazing, effective story. And it just goes to show that sometimes style can be so powerful and immersive that you're entertained thoroughly, and then a story with a very complex amounts of the supernatural or plot or plot twists, it doesn't really matter. At least it doesn't for me. And so there's something pure about the simplicity of these types of stories. Also, there's something to learn from there. I had another thought, but I can't remember it. And I pride myself on doing these videos in one take with no edits to preserve a sort of authenticity. So I'm going to have to end it right there. Yes, highly recommend The Long Walk by Stephen King. 10 out of 10. Ciao.